Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel, and today we're going to celebrate the picnic. And the reason for celebrating the picnic is the fact that this month it's not just plastic free July. If you think back to before we was on Hadrian's Wall, we did a video all about cow's horn as a fantastic alternative to plastic. Well, this month is also picnic month, along with a lot of other things as well. I don't think there's a day that goes by or a month that goes by without a hashtag of some sort on Twitter. So where does the humble picnic come from? Well, if you think about a picnic, we always think of putting a blanket on the floor out in the countryside somewhere, maybe popping along to an English Heritage or National Trust property and having a little picnic there in the gardens, taking out the flask, getting out the sandwiches, that sort of thing. However, the picnic has evolved to be that. If you go back in history, we have enjoyed outdoor eating for quite some time. You could say Stone Age people were the first ones to have picnics because they generally killed an animal, they butchered it, and in a way processed it on site. So you could say they were probably the first picnickers in history. However, really, picnicking or outdoor heating comes into its own really in the Middle Ages. So when, for example, the nobility, the barons, for example, the knights went out and hunted, especially the royal family, for example, they would take a huge entourage with them. So they would ride out with whatever weapons they needed, for example, boar spears, maybe even a bow and a vast selection of arrows. And they would ride out with a huge number of other people that carried everything. And we're talking about tables, we're talking about wine, we're talking about goblets, plates, knives, all that sort of thing. And what would happen is, halfway through the day when the hunt was being really successful, they would stop, and what would happen is a tent or a canopy would be put up, and the food that was hunted earlier in the day would actually be cooked, and you could have, for example, a whole boar being cooked over a makeshift fire. They'll dig a fire trench, fill it with firewood, start the fire, put the meat on a spit, start turning that around whilst the hunt's still going hard ahead, and also start bringing out the food that they brought with them, which was usually pies. Interestingly, there was a lot of pies consumed years ago. And the hunting feast, as it was really, is probably the first true type of picnic that we have. Now, there is actually a book. I've wrote down the name because it's not in English at all, and it's a book that's dated from 1387 called The Livre de Chasse, which is basically a book all about hunting food when you're out on a hunt. So this is obviously aimed purely at the nobility and feasting like kings, basically. So next time you're tucking into a jam sandwich covered in ants and on a picnic somewhere in drinking your glass of squash, maybe, just think you're actually doing something that the nobility used to do when they went on the grand hunts on the royal estates, for example. But then there's really a decline after that, really. We know people like Elizabeth I and Henry VIII did similar, but really when you get to the Civil War in the period afterwards, the outdoor eating thing becomes something that is really focused on poor people. If you think about the labouring classes, the agricultural labourers, for example, they would be in fields ploughing, harrowing, or maybe sowing seeds or something like that, or even doing things such as ditch digging. And they would usually carry, wrapped up in a small piece of cloth, their bread, cheese, and maybe a tankard of ale to drink to refresh them whilst they're working outside. But then when we get to the late Georgian, in what is often referred to the Regency, so the early period really of the 19th century, it becomes the in thing again to get out and eat outdoors. And we hear of all sorts of things, including, which is always combined with tea drinking, things like the pleasure gardens. So once again, we find a leisure activity to eat outside, and in a way the popularity grows from there. But when we get to the Victorian era, that's really when the picnics that we think of today starts to develop even further. And in a weird sort of twist, it also goes back to the old days of the hunting feast. Now, Mrs. Beeton, we use it all the time. This is Helen's copy, so I have to be very careful with this copy. There is actually a chapter in here on food for picnics, for example, and that's because the Victorians, especially if you think of Queen Victoria, when she went to Scotland, for example, in the summer, she would often have an outdoor feast, which is very similar to the hunting feast, but we would call it a picnic today. And once again, she would ride off into the countryside, up onto the heaths and moors, and along with her would be an entourage carrying the tableware, the napkins, and a huge number of baskets. Now, this one is one that we use quite a bit of, and this is the sort of thing that they would have. But they would have horses and carriages and wagons loaded massively with these, and the large house, for example, would be preparing all this. And they would also use something known as a hay box, which was usually a wooden box with a metal box inside, lined with hay, and that was used to keep things like soups and things like that nice and warm, so they could have something warm whilst out shooting, for example. It does continue. The whole idea of the picnic afterwards becomes a traditional thing to do, and then when we get into the 1900s, people find that they do have more leisure time. Reason being, you've got bank holidays now. You even get, later on in history, paid holidays, so people do decide to have a little break, for example, maybe a day or a few days out in the countryside. And what that leads to is people having picnics on a bigger scale. We know by the time you get to just before the Second World War, so in the 1930s, there are more people getting out into the countryside. There's this big roaming and hiking tradition that starts up, really. However, some people can't always get outside, and obviously living in Britain, we're used to the weather ruining things like picnics. Well, I've got another piece of information here, and this is the Home Entertainer book, and in here there is advice on how to have a picnic if you can't go outside. So if you are struggling to social distance during the COVID-19 restrictions, or for example it's a miserable day and pouring down a rain, you might want to decide to have an indoor picnic, and we have got a drawing in here. It's a fantastic drawing. There we go. Hopefully you'll be able to see it where you are. This is a 1930s book, and you can tell by the illustrations in it, and it encourages you to have what is often referred to as a picnic or a hiking party. And it goes on to say here, guests are asked to come in hiking garb, so put on your best khaki shorts and your boots in a hat to keep the sun off. Bring forth your food, your knives, your forks, even your harmonicas, it says. And then don't sit on the furniture, sit up on the floor on a blanket in your front room. And it says, just to get the authentic feel, a campfire is provided using an electric lamp covered in red and yellow muslin cloth. Now, I wouldn't really recommend putting cloth over a lamp or a light bulb or anything like that. It can get hot and can catch fire. But here they say that acts as the fake campfire. And then it also says you can have a sing-song and play games, the sort of things that you would do when you're on a picnic. However, you can't really throw a football around, so there are alternative games. There is, for example, one game known as the Surface Dive, where it says take a magazine or book from a bookshelf, place it on the floor, and then it says take your right hand and hold your left ear, and then it says take your left hand and hold your right big toe, and then bend down and attempt to pick the book up using your mouth, which personally sounds an unbelievably dangerous thing to do. There are other games that you can have. For example, there's the energetic game known as Orange Battling, and an orange battle, as shown in the picture there, is where you have an orange on a spoon, and then you have in your other hand a spoon. So you have two spoons and one orange, and you pair up, and the idea is you've got to protect your spoon with the orange on it and use the empty spoon to knock the enemy's spoon, or knock the enemy's orange off their spoon. As it says, it's an energetic game for a number of players. It sounds like mayhem if you ask me. There's always games such as lemon golf as well. If you don't want to damage your home, you take your golf clubs and you knock a lemon around the room and you mark particular points where you have to aim your lemon, for example. And this book is just full of very valuable information. But most people by the 1930s, even the 1940s, were quite happy to go on a picnic, especially if they owned a car, and there was more car ownership in the 1930s and 40s than there ever has been. So a little drive into the countryside with your picnic basket and set up in a farmer's field. People did it all the time. But then we have the Second World War, where there is restrictions to moving around the countryside. And you have to remember, especially in the case of D-Day in 1944, most of the fields all over the country, really, to be fair, including lay-bys, were often used as guarded ammunition dumps. So the right to roam as such really started to disappear during the war years. But there was a big increase in the 1950s and more so into the 1960s, and that's when you get these sort of picnic sets come out, and these would open up showing all your finery made of not quite the plastic that we have today, but a very heavy hard wearing plastic, and also the famous Tupperware, which was very common in the 1960s. And really, the picnic is still here. It's changed a lot since the original hunting feast, really, but I'm sure this summer you will probably get out and have a picnic. You may have a picnic planned for this weekend, for example. Anyway, on that note, we would like to hear your picnic stories. What's the sort of things that you pack on a picnic? Where would your recommended place to go on a picnic be, for example? Let us know all your stories, because we do like oral history, and that is really gathering the information from friends, family, and people who want to share their stories about an historic event. Anyway, on that note, if you are having a picnic, enjoy it. Even if you're going to have an indoor one if it's bad weather this weekend. So stay safe, remember the rules that are laid out for you, social distancing and all that sort of thing, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye bye.